I don't have time to begin to do justice to a full introduction for all of our speakers. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to focus on the title and the name of each of our speakers. We're going to go sequentially. We are going to hear from 5 speakers, have a short discussion afterwards, take a break, and then come back and hear from the rest of our speakers. I will say I'm particularly happy that our first speaker is very, very appropriate first speaker, Stan Meiburg, who up until Friday was the longtime Deputy Regional Administrator in Region 4 of the EPA. 36 years, and I just want to say this one thing, that if you work for EPA for 36 years, they don't give you a watch, but they give you a fan with your picture on it. So for those students considering what you want to do in your professional career, I highly recommend the EPA. So, Stan.
I'm glad he has to find this. Well, while Jeff's finding the presentation, I will say I wasn't sure what Jeff was going to say when he talked about titles, because I was the only person who was on the panel who has no title at all, except retired. But I do want to commend the Environmental Finance Center here, because it was one of the first ones in the country, and the leadership that Jeff and Richard Wisnett did in setting this thing up, I felt I had some opportunity to be kind of present at the creation, and what a wonderful creation it has been. Also, I'm very pleased to be here in North Carolina. I have native roots, as many of you know, and especially not only glad to be here with Assistant Secretary Mr. Gillespie from North Carolina Diener, but also some of the predecessors, Bill Holman and Bill Ross, who I know walked in the room, and I suspect there's some other Diener alumni here as well. So my congratulations to all of you. Okay, my first thing is, what do I do to actually advance it? Look at that. I want to talk about making environmental finance sustainable. We use the word sustainability a lot in environmental protection. And part of the point here when you think about environmental finance is how do we preserve the resources of the environment for future generations, which is all about sustainability. But when you talk about sustainability and environmental finance, it's how do we do those things without unduly burdening future generations with the cost of protecting those resources, or flipped it around the other way, how do we make sure future generations are paying their share of the cost, and while we are paying our share of the cost now? And there are a number of different points I want to make quickly. The first is, in doing environmental protection, you've got to build a sensible business case. And I'll pick on, just as a homely example, Jeff's example about light bulbs. All of us like LEDs and compact fluorescents and how much energy they save and so forth. But if you're in a building and you have an incandescent light bulb in the socket, and you're using this light bulb only once every 6 months for 15 minutes, it is not cost effective to go replace that bulb. So you really have to make a good solid business case when you're thinking about sustainable environmental finance. A second point to bear in mind is the future is not going to be like the past, and the past is not coming back. And I have something very specific in mind in that regard. Back in the 1970s, when I started with EPA, one of the foundation elements of environmental protection and environmental finance were grants for wastewater treatment and collection systems. The federal government in those days was paying 75% of the cost of wastewater treatment systems and collection systems. Those days are not coming back. Those days are not coming back. And the sooner we kind of come to grips with that, the better off we are. We've seen transitions from funding environmental protection from general revenues to fees, with the one notable exception of the Superfund program, where, for reasons that get into the politics of Superfund, we're now paying for out of general revenue instead of out of fees, which is arguably a poor public policy choice, but it is what it is. In general, you've seen that, and this mirrors what's going on in transportation. For somebody like me who lived in the triangle between 1985 and 1990, who comes in here now and then sees all these toll roads, you know that life has changed, and environmental protection bears some resemblance to that. It's always been astonishing to me that the Title V fees, which we built into the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, were not emulated for the water pollution permit fees program, and I do commend that to those of you who are in public policy to give some thought to that initiative. Another place we've seen changes is from public sector finance to private sector, or at least to public-private partnerships, and that's occurring in wastewater and drinking water systems all around the country. But to do that, you also have got to find some way to make sure to have the public understand that these costs are real and that they affect the way they live. We also have seen shifts from command and control mechanisms and regulation to market mechanisms. The one everybody talks about, of course, is the acid rain control program, but it's not limited to that. And as EPA moves forward in looking at greenhouse gases, I think you're going to see a tremendous amount of mechanisms discussed relating to environmental finance for those kind of controls, modeled perhaps on the RGGI formulas in the northeastern United States or markets that you've seen in California. And that's a big deal for this current administration and for the administrator. There will be a set of proposed rules coming out at the beginning of June. I'm sure there will be a lot of interest paid in that area. A next point is that we really now in government and in all elements of our life are working on building networks and alliances. Again, this in some ways is a model of moving from command and control to market mechanisms, but it also means that government has changed. We aren't talking so much now about top-down hierarchies as we are about this great network of governance. And the more effectively you can build those things, find people with common interests to work with you. Given that no organization can do everything by themselves, this will strengthen environmental finance just as it does other aspects of environmental protection. And that requires you to identify common interests. And sometimes you find that people have common interests in places you don't expect. For example, an environmental justice community in Gulfport, Mississippi, discovered that some of their best allies were the Audubon Society, because the community in which they live, which had long-term flooding and infrastructure problems, also happened to be one of the stopovers on the Gulf Flyway. And because of the interests of bird watchers, if you will, in sustaining those things, they were able to form alliances with this community to help bring about improvements in the way in which they lived. An interesting example, there are common interests everywhere. Part of our job is to find those interests and focus on those, not just on positions that may divide us. We need to do better in quantifying ecological services, and I throw this challenge out to all of you economists in the room, because everybody knows these things have value, but it's very hard to put a number on them. Putting a number on them will help mean that they can be quantified and financed. I think this particular message should be preaching to the choir here in the Environmental Finance Center community. It is still the case that people who can come out of various programs and not have the literacy that they need in how to pay for environmental protection, the more we can promote that literacy, the better off we are. And Mike, I really commend the work you're doing here at the School of Government to help increase that literacy for people who are pursuing careers in the public sector in the future. It's critically important. And finally, this is the soft skill, if you will. All of us together have got to find ways to support each other, whether we are private sector, public sector, non-governmental, federal, state, local, community, you name it. We are all in this together. As Lisa Jackson, the former administrator, used to famously say, if you like clean air, you like clean water, you like clean land, then you are an environmentalist. We are indeed all in this together, and to the degree we can support each other and bring our own particular insights to the job of sustaining the environment and paying for it in sustainable ways, the better off we will be. So thank you very much for the chance to be here, even untitled.